balance. Now, the idea of decisional balance is this idea that we often utilize many, many times in our lives, right? Especially when we're making kind of high stakes decisions. Think about, purchasing a car, maybe, buying a home, changing schools, moving to a different town, a relationship. You sit there and you weigh the pros versus the cons. So this is something we do. Now, generally, it's something that, we initiate within our own mind. We kind of contemplate the pros and the cons and the process and everything. And then a lot of times we might seek outside, support or counsel, where we ask other people for their opinions, because obviously their opinions may weigh in on our decisions. But this idea of decisional balance is something that we should all go through. So what we're going to talk about here is kind of a systematic process that you can go through, because what you start to do in completing this worksheet that you see in front of you is you start to kind of map out a blueprint for whether you will or will not change, but more importantly, how you will go about changing. So this is the way that, I suggest you do it, right? So the easiest thing to do is either on a piece of paper or using some sort of, digital device is create a, 4 quadrants like you see right there. And you can label them quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? Now what you're going to first do is identify in quadrants 1 and 2, what are the benefits that you might get associated with this change, and what are the sacrifices or the cost that's going to come with it. So let's use weight loss as an example. So imagine you have a goal of losing 20 pounds. Okay, so what I want you to do is, using this quadrant system right here, is in box 1, quadrant 1 if you want to call it, is to identify every positive outcome that might be associated with you losing 20 pounds. So for example, you might say, I'm going to feel healthier. I'm going to feel, sexier. I'm going to be more appealing to my, significant others. I might be a better role model to my kids, whatever they might be. There's an endless list here. I just want you to check off, what positive outcomes you believe you will enjoy as a result of losing 20 pounds. Now, once you've completed quadrant 1, move over to quadrant 2. And in quadrant 2, what you're going to do now is identify what costs, what sacrifices you're going to have to make. This might be the sacrifice of time, the sacrifice of, money. It might be the sacrifice of having to carve out more, or prioritize more things related to a healthy lifestyle and giving up some of your social aspects where you might be, overeating, say at restaurants. Right? It doesn't matter what they are here. You just want to list kind of blank slate of paper. Quadrant 1, the benefits I will enjoy as a result of losing 20 pounds and the costs that come with it. Now, what I want you to do at this point, once you've completed those top 2 quadrants, is to then score each of those items that you identified using a simple scaling system, for example, a 1 to 10, with 1 being unimportant and 10 being very important. And score each of those. Now, what I'm looking for here, or what you should be looking for, is if you score anything in quadrant 2 with a high score, you've just discovered what we call a barrier or an obstacle. In other words, what you believe you need to give up is just too important for you to give up. And that might be what's holding you back from starting, because in your mind, the sacrifice that you believe you have to make on those things that you identified in quadrant 2 are just too important. And that's why you're kind of ambivalent. That's why you're hesitant about starting. Now, you can never convince yourself or tell yourself or have someone tell you, don't worry about it, you'll figure it out. No, this is in your mind. You have to address it. So we're going to leave those for a moment. You've completed quadrants 1 and 2. Now I want you to go over to quadrant 3. And in quadrant 3, what you're looking at is now listing every task. We call it the process, right? Every task or action that you believe you're going to have to do repeatedly in order to achieve that 20-pound weight loss so you can enjoy those benefits that you listed in quadrant 1. So hopefully you see the difference. Quadrant 1 and 2 are all about outcomes. Quadrant 3 is about the process. And in quadrant 3, you're just going to list. So you might say, I'm going to have to go to the gym 5 times a week. I'm going to have to start, carving out time to prepare home cooked meals to take with me to school or to work. I'm going to have to, remove all the candy from my house. I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to have to do that. And that's fine. There's really no limit here too. Everything you believe you need to do. And then I want you to be honest with yourself. Once you've completed quadrant 3 is to score everything that you listed there. Again, using that same scale of 1 to 10, how likely you are to sustain each of those actions indefinitely. Now, remember, this is for yourself, so be honest with yourself here. If you say, for example, I believe I need to go to the gym 5 times a week. Great, now I want you to score. How likely do you think you are to be able to do that indefinitely? I'm not talking about for 1 to 2 weeks. I'm talking about indefinitely, because you want to lose weight and sustain that weight loss, which means this is a process you believe you need to be able to do indefinitely. And again, no one's passing judgment here. This is just self-awareness. And if you score things poorly, for example, you think, there's no way I'm going to go to the gym 5 times a week. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to score that at 2. Well, again, you've now discovered additional barriers, because essentially what you believe you need to do, you don't think you can do it, at least indefinitely. So what you've got now, after you've completed 1, 2, and 3, you're starting to get a little bit of a snapshot, because you are documenting things, and this is really a snapshot of how you see this process, which starts to do what? Give you insight as to whether you will start or not start. Now, we're going to have to make some changes here, because this is your current mindset. And if we look at your current mindset, and you've got things that are scored highly in quadrant 2 and things that are scored poorly in quadrant 3, we fundamentally have some problems. Because if you think about it, what is our ultimate goal here? Our ultimate goal is to look at everything in quadrant 2 and score them very low. In other words, we don't perceive these to be big sacrifices. Whatever I'm giving up is no big deal. And when we look at quadrant 3, whatever you believe you need to do, you need to have certainty that you can do this indefinitely. In other words, these are tasks I know I can continue doing. That is our goal. And until you can change that, you're always going to encounter problems either starting or sustaining this behavior. So here's what you do next. Now, this is where coaches would come in to help, but this is where you do what you do next if you're working through this alone. You look at each of those statements in quadrant 3, right? I should be more specific. Let's look at the quadrants that you scored poorly in quadrant 3. So let's talk about the ones that you scored maybe in the 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, things that you don't believe you can sustain. And ask yourself a simple question. You identified that this is something that you need to do. So ask yourself the simple question. Why did I score a 3 and not a 1? Now, I wouldn't say, pay attention to how I phrase that question to myself. Why did you score a 3 and not a 1? Think of the question that way rather than saying, why did I score a 3 and not a 10? Because if you scored it, if you answer the question that way, in other words, why did I score a 3 and not a 10? What you're starting to prompt is rationalizing why you can't do it. I know it's important, but I only scored a 3 because I can't do it because of A, B, C, and D. That's not going to help you. What you want to do is phrase the question. Why did I score that a 3 and not a 1? Because now you're prompting a thought process, a narrative in your mind as to, this is something I believe I need to do, even though I can't do it. So you're now going to start thinking through why it is important and what you can do to stick to this kind of task. And what you've got to do is essentially through that process is come to some understanding of what is realistic for you. So maybe going to the gym 5 days a week is not realistic, but maybe 3 times a week is. So as you kind of ask yourself that question, why did I score a 3 and not a 1? And it starts to prompt some ideation on your part as to, well, this is important. It's something that I probably need to do, but I don't think I can do it 5 times a week. So how many times could I do it? Preparing home cooked meals, to take to school or to work every day is not something that I think I can do consistently, but I believe it's important. So what can I do? You start focusing on what you can do, and you start coming up with something realistic. So maybe it is, I think I could really only get to the gym 2 to 3 times a week. I think I only have an hour on the weekend to kind of start preparing some foods for the early part of the week. You're just being realistic with yourself. And then what I want you to do is to change those answers in quadrant 3. Change it from going to the gym 5 days a week to going to the gym 2 to 3 times a week. Change it from, investing 1 hour of prep time every day to prepare my lunch for school or work the next day, to finding an hour on Sunday to prepare some food for the early part of the week. Find realistic solutions for yourselves. And when you have them, rescore yourself. And what you might find, and what you should find, is now that you're rescoring, those scores in quadrant 3 should be going up. That's your goal. Now, once you've done that and you've completed this process with quadrant 3, go back to quadrant 2 and rescore. Because if you'd put some things like a sacrifice of time, and you scored that as too important, like I just don't have the time. But now we go back and look at quadrant 3, and in quadrant 3, what we're noticing is you're not committing 5 days a week, you're only committing 2 to 3 times a week. You're not committing to 1 hour of meal prep every day, you're committing to 1 hour on the weekends. That might allow you to change some of your scores in quadrant 2. Remember, our goal is we're trying to lower the scores in quadrant 2 as much as possible, and we're trying to increase the scores in quadrant 3 to the best of our ability. You can't just do it, you have to go through a thought process. And hopefully as you modify quadrant 3, it allows you to rescore your choices in quadrant 2. Now, what else can we do here? Well, this is where a support system can come in. If you have the opportunity or the inclination to talk to someone else, maybe they have ideas, and this is where you can enter them in quadrant 4. So quadrant 4 is usually where a coach or a support system will offer their ideas, things that maybe you haven't considered. And you list them in like, oh, I never thought about that. That would be kind of nice, not having to go to the gym, just being active maybe on my breaks at work. And those, little movement minutes can all add up to a workout. I didn't think about that. And maybe your support systems, your coach, the person with whom you're talking to, is providing some suggestions for you in quadrant 4. Or you're doing your own research on the internet, you come across ideas. You do a little, AI search, or you find some websites and they propose some great little ideas to you. You might say, I never thought about that. I'm going to add those to quadrant 4. And as you add those in, see if it makes a difference in quadrant 2. In other words, go back and rescore quadrant 2 now that you've added things into quadrant 4. Now, there's usually one last step that I will do when I'm coaching, is if I've had a moment to collect your core values. Remember, your core values are those values that are dear and sacred to you, right? In other words, you will always invest a little bit extra time, energy, and resources to further your pursuit of your core values, because they fundamentally represent everything that embodies who you are and everything you want to become. Now, when you're in your 20s, these are still being shaped because you don't have a professional career, you don't have a family yet. But once you become a mature adult, when I say by mature adult, you've graduated, you're in a profession, you've got a family, your core values will start to solidify. So pending with whom I'm working, if I do have core values, what I'll do is say, that 20 pounds that you want to lose could also contribute positively to some of your core values. For example, let's say one of your core values was to be successful in my career. I might help you connect the dots that, if you could lose 20 pounds, it's probably going to help with your work productivity, because you could maybe have more energy at work and that'll allow you to be more productive, and I'll give you advancement opportunities. So those last two steps, in other words, filling in quadrant 4, are largely dependent on having someone else to share ideas with, or I shouldn't just say someone else, something else. Could be AI, could be a website that you find. And quadrant 1, I always look for the opportunity if I have access to your core values. And this is something that you might be able to do, but your own core values. This is something I bring in when I'm coaching or helping, a patient or a client. So at the end of this, what we're looking at is kind of a snapshot. This is kind of what you are buying into. You are recognizing at this point now, at the completion of this worksheet, hey, I have a lot of benefits, important benefits that I'm getting out of this 20-pound weight loss. The sacrifices I'm making are hopefully not that high anymore. In other words, it's not too costly to commit to this. The process by which I'm going to go through to achieve or attain that 20 pounds is something that I think I can do in a sustainable manner. And you know what? I learned some creative ideas of things I can add that I'm going to try. And this becomes your plan. This is going to become how you, or the blueprint from which you develop your game plan. So that's called decisional balance. And at the end of the day, what you're doing here, if you think about it, is we're just swaying your decision in favor of the pros, which is quadrant 1 and 3, and we are minimizing the relevance of quadrant 2, which is the cons. It's what we do in our minds all the time. This is just a kind of structured, systematic approach to doing it, to kind of see how your mindset is shifting and creating kind of more of a tangible, visible sort of game plan. Now, the other thing I want to talk about very quickly here is the idea of willpower and fear-mongering. Not exactly connected to decisional balance, but something that merits conversation, right? Now, in this idea of willpower, all right, we talk about willpower. It goes by many definitions, but one of the basic ideas of willpower is the ability to delay, resist temptation, all right? To, sort of impede the desire for instant gratification, right? And we know that willpower is always strongest in the early part of the day than it is towards the latter part of the day. Think, for example, if I put a treat that you find very tempting, like chocolates, and I put it in front of you first thing in the morning, but I also put it in front of you last thing in the evening, not necessarily last thing, but in the evening, and I was to ask you, when are you most likely to eat those chocolates? Most people would answer at the end of the day, and they would be correct. Reason being is because in the morning, we see several things. Number one, you have an agenda. You are distracted. You have an agenda. You have a game plan. Like, I got to get ready for work, get ready for school, get out the door. I got to do this. I got to do that. And you don't really have time to really focus on that treat. So it's easy to say no. But that's not exactly the only reason. The bigger reason is we now look at willpower much in the same way that we talk about your muscle. When your muscles are rested, they have the capacity to do a lot of work, to work optimally. But when the muscle is fatigued, it doesn't work as well, all right, as it does when it's rested. And we look at the brain in the same way. In the morning, you come out of an overnight rest. Your brain is rested. It is like that rested muscle. It is ready to do some good work, which means it can control willpower. Because willpower takes resources, just like doing repetitions takes energy. Exercising willpower takes energy. And we talk about two parts of the brain. We talk about your cortex, which is kind of the frontal portion of your brain. And this is where we exercise a lot of self-control. We have the opportunity for, higher thinking, for critical thinking, for decision making. But somewhere buried deep in the middle of our brain, in the limbic region of our brain, is kind of where our impulsive system lives. And some people look at them as a cool system, the rational kind of, logical processing system, and the hot system, which is kind of our impulsive reactionary system. And it's really a battle. When we are exercising strong willpower, it means our cool system is dominating over the impulsive hot system. And vice versa. When we give in to temptation, when we are weak with our willpower, it's the other way around. But we believe this is what happens through the day. Your brain is working all day long, and just like a muscle that's doing a lot of sets and reps, the brain fatigues, which means as the day progresses, that impulsive side starts to become stronger and stronger. And that's one of the theories that explains how willpower works. So is this inevitable that as the day proceeds, we're not going to be able to resist temptation? Well, not so much. I mean, there's a greater tendency, but there are ways that you can strengthen willpower. All right. And there are certain ways. Number one, we talk about, self-control. In other words, expose yourself to those temptations in the morning when your brain is stronger, because that kind of builds a little bit of resiliency. So, for example, if those chocolates are your weak point, put that bowl of chocolates in front of you in the morning, and you will learn over time to exercise stronger willpower against those chocolates. We also say, well, one thing you can do is to help yourself resist temptation is to avoid temptation. So in the latter part of the day, when you know you're more prone to those bad behaviors, get them out of sight, out of mind. Hide those chocolates. We also talk about developing an emergency action plan, an EAP. And there's several ways you can do this. One way is through social connections and social engagement. Having a support system, but more importantly, that social engagement is a distraction. It allows you to focus on the people you're with, and that might distract you from thinking about that chocolate treat. So social connections can be support, where a person will support you in your desire to not, eat those chocolates or give in to temptation, but it could also be the distraction that you need. Another EAP plan is this idea of reflection with gratitude. If you take a moment as you are kind of starting to give in to temptation, to think about everything that you've accomplished, that you are grateful for, that you're proud of, what that does, it changes your mindset. It triggers the release of positive compounds, neurotransmitters in the brain, and that elevates your mood, and that can do what? Give you a little bit of boost of willpower that you might need. So this idea of reflecting with gratitude is something you can do too. We also have a thing called implement intention, which is kind of a what-if scenario. Our brain always keeps a little bit of reserve, just like our cars have that little reserve tank of gas that as the tank empties, that little light goes on saying, hey, you're kind of low, but we've got a little bit left in reserve for you. We do the same thing there, because at times we might need to tap into that in order to do what? Worst case scenario, to survive. So what we want to do in this what if is to kind of have proactive thinking. If you are fully aware, self-aware of the fact that I'm going to be someone that gives into temptation in the latter part of the day, what you want to do is to proactively start to set up an environment. What if I start to feel this weakness? What am I going to do? Don't live by an all or nothing. Maybe have some idea of, I will agree to have a little bit, but then I need to go do something else to distract me. In other words, come to a compromise. Because what you can do is allow yourself a little indulgence, but then you're tapping into that little reserve to help you avoid full-fledged, collapse into the temptation. So that's a little bit on willpower. Last thing I want to talk about here is this idea of fear-mongering. All right? This idea of fear-mongering is using messages that are intended to scare you or coerce you, all right, into behaving in a certain way. The classic example is in some parts of the world on the cigarette packs, they put those gruesome pictures of diseased lung and people who are suffering the plight of, lung cancer. And they're doing that as a tactic to try and scare the crap out of you. But unfortunately, what we find with research is it doesn't always work. A lot of times, fear-mongering doesn't actually trigger a cessation of bad behaviors or a replacement with good behaviors. What it does, it triggers inaction. In other words, a freeze, kind of like a deer in headlights. And so if we start to recognize one thing, our brain is hardwired for positive information, for positive experiences, then maybe we recognize fear-mongering doesn't work. So rather than resorting to fear-mongering where you threaten yourself, if I don't do this, this is going to be the consequence. That doesn't always work. So don't, beat yourself up. Don't kind of bully yourself into submission. That may not be the best strategy. Positive strategies might be a better approach. So one is called social incentives. And what we mean by social incentives is, we are social creatures and we like to be what? Connect with others. So inclusion is better than isolation or exclusion. So rather than this idea, there's a statement, that I always use when I'm teaching, rather than saying, hey, 9 out of 10 people who don't do this will suffer a heart attack. Right? Now you're fear-mongering. What you could do instead is saying, people that participate in this enjoy a healthier life. That's putting a positive spin onto everything. And so that's what we mean by social incentives. Look to, rather than thinking about, if I don't do it, in other words, if I'm excluded from this behavior, this is the consequences. Oh my gosh, it's dire. Don't do that. Think about, if you do participate, these are the benefits you enjoy. Rephrase and reframe the way you think about, kind of things like that. 2 is look for immediate rewards. Our brain thrives on immediate gratification. Remember, the release of dopamine doesn't necessarily happen because of a reward. A lot of times it happens in anticipation of a reward, of a positive experience, not necessarily just a reward, a thrill, an adventurous, a great time. So yeah, let's use that either anticipation of positive rewards or actual rewards, right? Especially when you're starting a new behavior, so that you can get that dopamine release and actually enjoy the experience. We should also believe that we have a sense of control here. One of the most important things is anytime we fear-mongering, we feel that we're out of control. This is not my choice. I have to do this because if not, this is the dire consequence. No. Think about, I choose to do this. I'm in control and I choose to do this because I want to be included in it so I can enjoy the benefits. So shift your frame of thinking away from it's something I have to do, which is where fear-mongering thrives, to something I choose to do, which is the exact opposite of fear-mongering. And then definitely monitor your progress. In other words, when you have a little setback, all right, don't frown and dwell on the setback. Think about what you've accomplished. You know, I kind of sometimes marvel at some of my students who get a 90% on an exam. And they sit there and they beat themselves up over the fact that they missed 2 questions. And I'm like, but what about the other 25 that you got correct? All right. Think of your accomplishment, not your setbacks. And a lot of times that is enough to do what? To shift your mindset from negative to positive. We've got to look at positive strategies. So there we have just a little conversation on willpower and on this concept of fear-mongering.